Welcome back to the Global Affairs Podcast. I'm your host, David, and today we're diving into a topic that's been shaking up markets and geopolitics alike: the escalating trade tensions between the United States and China in 2025. To help us unpack this complex issue, we're joined by Dr. Emily Chen, an economist and trade policy expert specializing in U.S.-China relations. Welcome, Emily.
Thanks, David. It's great to be here. This is a critical moment for global trade, and I'm looking forward to breaking it down with you.
Absolutely. It's hard to miss the headlines about tariffs and trade wars. For listeners who might need a refresher, can you give us a quick overview of what's driving these tensions right now?
Sure. The current wave of U.S.-China trade tensions kicked off earlier this year when the Trump administration imposed a 10% tariff on Chinese imports in February, citing issues like unfair trade practices and the fentanyl crisis. Things escalated quickly. By April, U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods hit 145%, and China retaliated with 125% tariffs on U.S. imports. Both sides have also rolled out non-tariff barriers, like China's restrictions on U.S. agricultural exports. This tit-for-tat has disrupted global supply chains and raised fears of economic decoupling.
Wow, 145% tariffs? That's staggering. It feels like we're back to the trade war of 2018, but on steroids. What's different this time around?
You're spot on, David. The scale is bigger and the stakes feel higher. In 2018, tariffs started at 10 to 25%, and the focus was narrower, mostly on addressing China's subsidies and intellectual property theft. Now, the rhetoric is broader, with the U.S. framing tariffs as a tool to tackle everything from trade deficits to national security concerns, like fentanyl trafficking. China, meanwhile, is doubling down on self-reliance, using export controls on rare earth minerals to hit back. Plus, the global context has shifted. Other countries are feeling the ripple effects, and there's less multilateral cooperation to cool things down.
Let's talk about those ripple effects. How are these tariffs impacting the global economy?
The impact is massive. Chinese exports to the U.S. dropped 21% in April alone, while their exports to Southeast Asia spiked as companies reroute supply chains. U.S. consumers are facing higher prices. Think electronics, clothing, anything made in China. Businesses on both sides are hurting. U.S. tech firms, for instance, get about 14% of their revenue from China, so these tariffs are squeezing their margins. Globally, the fear of a recession is real, especially since trade between the world's two largest economies is worth nearly $700 billion annually. The World Trade Organization's 2025 outlook is grim, predicting slower global trade growth if this continues.
That's sobering. But there was some good news recently, right? I read about a temporary de-escalation. What's the deal with that?
Yes, there's a sliver of hope. On May 12th, both sides agreed to a 90-day truce, slashing U.S. tariffs from 145% to 30% and Chinese tariffs from 125% to 10%. China also lifted some export restrictions on critical minerals. The talks in Geneva, led by U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, marked the first face-to-face negotiations since the tariffs spiked. It's a step back from the brink, but it's temporary, and the underlying issues, trade deficits, technology competition, and geopolitical mistrust, are still unresolved.
So, it's a pause, not a resolution. What's the mood in Washington and Beijing right now? Are they serious about negotiating, or is this just posturing?
It's a mixed bag. In Washington, there's pressure to show strength, especially with Trump's base, who see tariffs as a way to bring manufacturing jobs back. But businesses and consumers are pushing back against tarifflation. That's the term for tariff-driven price hikes. In Beijing, Xi Jinping is focused on economic stability, especially with China's GDP growth forecasts cut to 4% due to trade disruptions. China's appointed a new trade negotiator, Li, who's a lawyer with WTO experience, signaling they're gearing up for complex legal battles. Both sides want a deal, but neither wants to look weak.
That's a classic standoff. Let's zoom in on China's strategy. You mentioned non-tariff barriers. What's Beijing doing to fight back without just matching tariffs?
Beijing's playbook is sneaky but effective. They've been using non-tariff barriers for years, and they've perfected it. For example, China's halted direct imports of U.S. beef, poultry, and LNG, citing things like insect infestations or safety concerns. They've also added U.S. companies like PVH and Illumina to their unreliable entity list and launched antitrust probes into Google. These moves let China block U.S. goods while claiming they're just following regulations. It's a way to hit MAGA-friendly sectors like agriculture and energy without escalating tariffs further.
That's clever and frustrating for U.S. exporters. What about the U.S. side? Is the tariff strategy working to achieve its goals?
It depends on the goal. If the aim is to reduce the U.S. trade deficit with China, it's questionable. Tariffs haven't historically closed that gap much, and the deficit was still $123.5 billion, with Vietnam alone in 2024, showing trade is just shifting. If it's about bringing jobs back, there's some evidence of manufacturing growth, but it's offset by higher consumer prices. The fentanyl angle is trickier. Tariffs might pressure China, but experts doubt they'll solve the opioid crisis. The bigger win for the U.S. is political. Tariffs rally Trump's base and project strength.
Speaking of politics, how much of this is about domestic audiences versus actual economic strategy?
A huge amount. In the U.S., Trump's tariffs are a campaign promise fulfilled, and his base loves the tough-on-China stance. Posts on X show his supporters cheering the 145% tariffs as a way to stick it to Beijing. In China, Xi uses the trade war to rally national pride, framing the U.S. as a bully. The state-run People's Daily has been pushing this narrative, urging self-reliance. Both leaders are playing to their home crowds, which makes compromise tricky. No one wants to look like they're caving.
That's a great point. Let's talk about the human cost. Who's getting hit hardest by this trade war?
It's the average consumer and small businesses. In the U.S., higher tariffs mean pricier goods. Your phone, clothes, even car parts. In China, exporters are laying off workers as U.S. orders dry up. Farmers in both countries are struggling. U.S. soybean and lumber exports are blocked, while Chinese factories are losing markets. Goldman Sachs estimates China's trade disruptions could cost millions of jobs. And globally, developing nations like Vietnam and Thailand are caught in the crossfire, facing pressure to pick sides.
It's a mess. What role are other countries playing? Are they just watching, or are they getting involved?
They're not just spectators. The EU's bracing for a flood of Chinese exports as Beijing redirects goods from the U.S. market. Europe's already debating higher tariffs on Chinese lithium-ion batteries to protect their own industries. ASEAN countries, like Vietnam, are benefiting from trade redirection, but risk getting squeezed if the U.S. or China demands loyalty. Japan and South Korea are trying to stay neutral, but their trade ministers met with China's in March, signaling they're hedging bets. Everyone's navigating this carefully.
Sounds like a global tightrope walk. Looking ahead, what's the best-case scenario for resolving this?
Best case? The 90-day truce leads to substantive talks that address core issues, maybe a deal on tech transfers or fentanyl cooperation. Both sides would need to make concessions. The U.S. could lower tariffs further, and China could ease non-tariff barriers. A stable framework, even if imperfect, could rebuild trust and stabilize markets. The WTO could play a role if both agree to its mediation, but it'll take political will, and that's the hard part.
And the worst-case scenario?
Full decoupling. If talks fail, tariffs stay high, and both sides double down on self-reliance. Supply chains fracture, inflation spikes, and global trade grinds to a halt. There's also a risk of escalation beyond trade. Think cyber attacks or military posturing over Taiwan. Some analysts even warn China could dump its $760 billion in U.S. debt, though that's unlikely since it'd hurt them too. The world economy would take years to recover.
That's a scary thought. Before we wrap up, any wild cards we haven't covered? Something that could shift the dynamic?
One to watch is technology. The U.S. is tightening export controls on chips and AI tech, which could choke China's innovation. But China's investing heavily in its own tech. Think Huawei and SMIC. If they pull off a breakthrough, it could shift the balance and force the U.S. to rethink its strategy. Another wild card is public opinion. If consumers in either country get fed up with price hikes or job losses, it could pressure leaders to compromise.
Fascinating stuff, Emily. We could talk for hours, but we're out of time. Thanks so much for joining us and shedding light on this tangled web of trade tensions.
My pleasure, David. Thanks for having me. Let's hope cooler heads prevail.
Fingers crossed. That's all for today's episode of the Global Affairs Podcast. Tune in next week when we'll explore another pressing global issue. Until then, I'm David, signing off.